Welcome back to the Bring Our Troops Home podcast. It is legislative season in the states, and for us, that means we are busy, and there's been so much going on this past week, and I want to bring you up to speed on as much of it as I possibly can, but we're really probably only going to have time for one major topic, and what I've picked today is the Defend the Guard hearing in the New Hampshire Senate that happened earlier this week. As many of you know, Defend the Guard passed the New Hampshire House on January 8th of this year with a 23-vote margin. That is massive. And that doesn't happen by accident. That happened because of discipline advocacy and strong bill sponsors, including Marine Corps veteran Representative Tom Mannion and others who worked tirelessly to get the bill through the House. They did a great job. From there, the bill transmitted over to the Senate. And for some reason, it went to the Senate Finance Committee, where, quite frankly, the deck appeared to be stacked against the bill before it ever arrived. All right, here we go. I'm going to play most of this hearing in real time so that you can hear the words for yourself. But to keep this from turning into a 3-hour episode, I'm going to run it at 1.5 speed as we move through it. But when we hit something important, a legal claim, a funding threat, a Title 10 reference, I'm going to slow it back down, pause it, and we're going to break it apart as best we can. Now, there were 4 people who testified in support of this bill, and they did an excellent job. And that was primarily our prime bill sponsor, Representative Tom Mannion, our Democratic co-sponsor, Representative Jonah Wheeler, a citizen advocate named Aubrey Friedman, and the great former state senator from Maine, Eric Brakey, who had one of his best testimonies I've ever heard from him. So there isn't much there to refute. They stuck to the Constitution and to real principles, but I want you to hear their words from their own mouth. So when we get past that, we're going to slow it down and really dig into the opposition testimony, because that's where the legal claims start getting muddy, and that's where clarity actually matters. So before we get going, I want you to pay close attention, and here we go.
All right, since we've had a change in audience, I do want to repeat that we don't really want to read your testimony. If it's written down, pass it in, talk to us from your heart, okay? Try not to repeat things that other people have said. It's all in the Senate rules, which is published up on the Senate website. So, and everybody's sitting down now, that's good. We do like people to sit and not be standing around. And with that, we'll have the introduction to the bill.
As the committee hearing begins, I want you to notice something immediately. 3 of the 8 members of the committee are not even in the room listening to testimony. The chairman, he makes a point at the beginning that written testimony will be reviewed prior to executive session and prior to voting. I want you to remember that. We'll revisit that later, because what happens at the end of this hearing will make that statement very important.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Tom Mannion representing Hillsborough 1 Pelham. I'm also a United States Marine Corps infantry combat veteran with 2 deployments in Operation Iraqi Freedom. I'm once again in front of this committee requesting a recommendation of ought to pass on HB 104, the Defend the Guard Act.
All right, this is our prime bill sponsor, Representative Tom Mannion. He's a former Marine with 2 combat deployments in Iraq, and this matters because the veterans of the global war on terror are the ones who paid the price. They're the ones pushing this bill. We are proud to have Tom as our prime sponsor in New Hampshire. He is a real champion, and having a champion makes this process much easier.
This bill requires Congress to formally declare war pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the United States Constitution before we will release our National Guard to Title 10 service for deployments to a foreign combat zone. It does not prevent activation for any other purpose, including constitutionally prescribed functions in Clause 15. To execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrection, repel invasions. It does not stop emergency response, nor overseas training in accordance with per pitch versus DOD. Our nation has not followed the Constitution since 1942. War declarations have been supplanted by authorizations for use of military force, which have allowed presidents of the last 10 administrations to act unilaterally overseas, and once forces are committed, to send the tab to Congress to be paid. This is an inversion of the founders' intent. As James Madison said, quote, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department." And yet, Congress has abdicated its responsibility for decades without a constitutional amendment to do so. And the reason this act continues to be filed in over 30 states every term is because of the lives lost, not just in combat, but also here at home. When Hurricane Katrina tore through New Orleans, the bulk of Louisiana's 256th Infantry Brigade and Mississippi's 155th Armored Brigade were deployed to Iraq with most of their equipment. Lieutenant General Blum of the National Guard Bureau cited these missing units and equipment as significantly hindering early search and rescue efforts, costing many American lives in the critical early days. This issue crops up over and over throughout the last 20 years. Shortly before Hurricane Helene ripped through Appalachia, 700 soldiers from the Tennessee's 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment were deployed to the Middle East. Yes.
You're reading to me, okay?
Roger.
I would rather you talk to me, okay? I don't know how much more you've got to go, but I don't really appreciate being read to. I want you to talk to me.
Understood. So with that paragraph I was outlining, so despite the first impetus of this bill occurred after Hurricane Katrina, where individuals saw that the lives lost from Americans were exacerbated by our units not being there. This has been a pattern over the decades since then. So not only that, but it's like we have these generals that show up in front of all these committees and they speak and they say, oh, well, we're going to lose funding. We're going to lose aircraft. We're going to lose tarmacs. But meanwhile, 2 more guardsmen were killed in Syria. We have Sergeants Edgar Brian Torres Tovar and William Nathaniel Howard of the Iowa National Guard lost their lives on December 13th in Palmyra, Syria. And the question that I saw all over social media was, why is the National Guard in Syria?
That's a good question. Representative Mannion asked the question that millions of Americans have quietly been asking. Why is the National Guard in Syria? We've never declared war on Syria. There is no Syria-specific authorization for use of military force. And the 2013 authorization vote in the Senate, it failed. President Obama couldn't get the authorization he wanted. And yet guardsmen have been deployed there since 2013. The 2001 AUMF was passed to target those who were responsible for 9/11. The 2002 AUMF was specific to Iraq, and stretching those into Syria requires legal gymnastics that Congress has never formally voted to authorize. So the question does stand. Why are the National Guard units engaged in foreign hostilities without a declaration of war? What in the hell are we doing there in Syria?
Why indeed? We didn't declare war on Syria. We never even passed an AUMF for Syria. It failed in the Senate in 2013. But still, we send men downrange and we send them to these areas without any formal declaration of war with no end in sight. So despite these assurances, and I say that we have allies in the Senate and in the U.S. Congress, we have Thomas Massey and Paul Gosar have been asked specifically about this bill.
About them.
Right, but they're about funding. So this is the funding question. They've been asked specifically about the funding behind this bill and the threat that most of the states, except for 2, have these massive fiscal notes. And the Congress has assured us that there is no funding threat. The funding has to be okayed by Congress. It is their job. They control the purse strings. So we have these congressmen on one hand saying, there's no threat. Congress approves the funding. No congressman is going to put their neck out on the line to defund any state National Guard. But despite these assurances, I know that I can't reach into the hearts of everybody here in Concord. So the House has amended this bill since the last time this body saw it. And now this bill will not go into effect until 4 other states pass it. It allows us as a smaller state to wait for reinforcements. And as such, I ask these folks in this committee to recommend ought to pass on HB 104.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Representative Will.
Thank you, Chairman Gray, members of the Senate Finance Committee. For the record, my name is Representative Jonah O'Ryan Wheeler, and I represent the towns of Peterborough and Sharon. And I'm here as a co-sponsor in favor of following the United States Constitution.
All right, this is important. This is our other sponsor, a Democrat. We have a Republican Marine veteran and a Democrat legislator standing together in support of the same bill. That tells you that this is not a partisan issue. Defend the Guard crosses party lines because the Constitution crosses party lines.
And that sounds like a political talking point, sounds almost pedantic, but it is 100% true. As Representative Mannion just mentioned, the United States has been engaged in military conflicts, some would call them a war, without the official declaration of war since 1942. That has included Korea and Vietnam, Syria, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and many more countries, which, again, have been decimated by actions taken by this government without the constitutional authority of the United States Congress. So what can we, the people, do about the fact that the federal government of our United States, or these United States, is seemingly not paying any attention to the founding documents which give it the public trust, the authority by which it enacts about $3.5 trillion worth of a budget every year? Well, what we can do is go to our state legislators who have the power over the National Guard men and women who are serving our state and say, those men and women will not be used in unconstitutional, some would call illegal wars. And this isn't from the peaceniks of those students in the Vietnam era or the hippies of the past anti-war movements that we have seen. As Representative Mannion spoke to, this is from the soldiers who have fought and died in these illegal wars, who remember the brothers and sisters that they brought home in body bags, shot with little justification whatsoever from the leadership of the country, which they still to this day would fight to serve.
And I can't tell you how much I appreciate Representative Wheeler for saying that part out loud. This is not the 1960s anti-war protest movement. Most of the people pushing this bill are veterans, and most of them are from the global war on terror, and many still maintain military discipline, military bearing, and a deep respect for service. This is not anti-war in the traditional sense. This is pro-Constitution. If war is necessary, then Congress should declare it. That's not a radical idea. That's the process that we've all subscribed to live in this republic.
So I am here as a co-sponsor and as a representative who wants this country to follow its constitutional obligations because, number one, it does not help us on the world stage to be fighting immoral, by virtue of illegal wars. It has actually demolished our national security on the world stage and made us the war machine of the world. And if that's what the United States wants to be, then that's what the United States can be. But that is not the moral superiority which is talked about in many discussions regarding foreign policy that our country has. And B, number two, it's the right thing to do by the soldiers who are, I can't even imagine the level of service. I mean, I believe in service to this country as a legislator, as an individual. When I speak to someone like Representative Mannion or any of the many other representatives who have served wars like Vietnam and others, Desert Storm, I think about the military actions that they undertook and the fact that they've fought here in the legislature for a long time for the United States to continue to follow its constitution. And I think the least that I could do for them as a citizen of this country who equally as believes in this constitution would be to support legislation withholding our troops that we have power over from going out into these illegal wars without the authorization of Congress, which would be the legal process by which the founders of our country set to declare war. So I'm not scared of the military industrial complex's threats of removal of funds because of the points that Representative Mannion brought up, those funds aren't going to be removed. I'd like to see a United States Congress that attempted to strike the funding of a National Guard branch entirely out of the one state in particular. I think that would set up constitutional and other kinds of issues that would be far beyond than that one piece of legislation. And I think that ultimately the lives of these soldiers and men are not, these military equipment, this tarmac, the guns and the weaponry is not worth more than the lives of these soldiers who are fighting and dying for our country in wars that are illegally authorized. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Questions from the senators?
Man, Representative Wheeler, he's right again. The life of a single soldier willing to lay down his life for the country is worth more than any piece of equipment, more than any procurement, more than any force alignment. It's more than any funding stream to the state. If we are going to ask the men and women to fight and die for this country, then the people's representatives should have the courage to vote on it first.
Seeing none, thank you very much. Friedman, Audrey? A-U-B-R-E-Y, it looks like. Friedman.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, Aubrey Friedman. I live in Bridgewater. I speak in support of this bill. I've testified in support of previous ones. This one, I just want to concentrate on the fiscal note because this is a finance committee. The risk of losing the funding. So in the fiscal note, I think it's conflating Title 32 with Title 10. Title 32 is supposed to be for when the New Hampshire Guard or any guard is working domestically in its own state or in the other states of the United States. We're talking domestic. And it is true that actually in that Title 32, the president does have the power to take back the money. It is clearly stated in there. But again, this is domestic stuff. Now, Title 10 is for deployment overseas. That's what this bill is talking about, deploying overseas, Title 10. And I don't see anything, that's under the authority of the president and so forth. So I don't see anything in Title 10 giving the president the authority to take back money if the guard doesn't perform what it's supposed to do. As far as the Congress, as was mentioned, has the power of the purse. Also, the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 does not allow the executive branch to claw back money that's been appropriated by the Congress. Only Congress can do that by rescission, and they actually did this last year. That's the way it works. The executive branch cannot do that. And furthermore, Congress loves the military. And as high as the budgets are, and they come over from the president, regardless of which administration, Congress is in the habit of adding more money to the military budget. They love the military. They're not going to be cutting back. I think this is a scare tactic that's used. And lastly, just about the amendment about adding 4 states or Massachusetts or Maine who might enact similar legislation. I think that's an improvement to this bill because the earlier version, New Hampshire might have been out on the limb and may be subject to retaliation, being the only one, but I think there's safety in numbers. So those are the reasons I support the bill, and I do think the risk of this defunding the $395 million is just not going to happen.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Friedman here, he lays out something critical. The funding threat is largely a paper tiger. We've been saying this for years. Title 10 governs overseas deployments. Title 32 governs domestic missions. The Impoundment Control Act restricts executive clawbacks of appropriated funds. What Mr. Friedman is doing here is he's offering a legal rebuttal to the funding scare tactic used by the opposition. And I want you to notice something else. When the funding threat is raised, the room seems very disinterested. It's like they've already bought into the threat. They already know the talking points. But when Mr. Friedman here is offering the rebuttal and he's explaining it, the attention of the senators is elsewhere. That dynamic is important to notice. It's worth paying attention to.
Mr. Grandy, in general, I'm going to ask you guys to go last so that you can summarize, and I'm going to take the rest of the people that are in support first. So Eric, Reiki. Yep.
Chairman Gray, Vice Chairman Innes, members of the committee, including happy to meet for the first time my senator, Senator Waters. My name is Eric Breakey. I'm a resident of Dover. I'm also a voluntarily retired 3-term state senator from Maine who moved to New Hampshire 2 years ago. Happy to call the Granite State my home. And I'm also the executive director of the New Hampshire Free State Project, but I'm here in my individual capacity, not representing any organization.
All right, this is Eric Breakey. He is a former Maine state senator and was the primary sponsor of Defend the Guard in Maine for years. I've watched him deliver some of the strongest testimony on this issue anywhere in the country, and what you're about to see might be his best testimony yet.
And I'm very proud to be here today in support of House Bill 104, colloquially known as the Defend the Guard Act. You know, I have to say, one of the things I love most when I come to the State House here in New Hampshire is that statue outside. And it reminds me, that statue of Daniel Webster, I'm always reminded of the example he set and also some of the prophetic wisdom that he imparted to future generations. And I just want to quote very briefly for you from Daniel Webster. He said, "It will be the solemn duty of state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and are interposed between their citizens and arbitrary power wielded by the federal government."
I love that he ties the issue to Daniel Webster, whose statue sits just outside the building. It reminds senators every time that they walk in that state governments have a duty to interpose when federal authority exceeds constitutional bounds. And folks, that's not a fringe theory. That is the exact definition of American federalism.
And that is exactly what this legislation is seeking to do. It is seeking to follow through on a duty that the state governments have to defend their National Guard troops from the arbitrary authority, from misuse of them by the federal government. Now, as previous speakers have noted, this situation of undeclared foreign wars has gone on for almost a century. But since the dawn of the War on Terror 25 years ago, we've been in a unique situation as far as it comes to National Guard troops. For the last 25 years, National Guard troops from the various different states have accounted for almost half of troops on the ground in these foreign wars, which was never the original vision for what the National Guard was supposed to be for. And of course, this has come at tremendous toll to our military men and women. It has come at tremendous toll to their families, to taxpayers. And as far as I can tell, the only tangible benefit that seems to have come from this is that certain military industrial complex contractors have gotten very rich off the situation. And I'm not reading my testimony, but I just do want to make sure I hit a couple of points. I do have laid out in my testimony some of the constitutional framework for this legislation, which you're welcome to review. I will just very briefly note that the Constitution is pretty clear about which branch of government the power to declare war and the responsibility to declare war resides in. It is the legislative branch. James Madison outlined the reasons why very well, that the executive branch has the most to gain from war and therefore is the most prone to it. Therefore, it's with studied care that the power to declare war was put in the hands of the legislature. The problem, however, is that on the congressional level, nobody in Congress wants to vote on war because they, as I see, they like to keep receiving the contributions from those who profit off of war without having to go on record and be held accountable by their constituents in election season for having voted for it. And so we're in a catch-22 situation where Congress will not take responsibility as they're constitutionally obligated to do, and therefore it falls to the state legislatures to defend their National Guard troops. And as was previously noted, the militia clause of the U.S. Constitution is very clear that the state militias, the state National Guards, can be mobilized for war purposes to suppress insurrection, to repel invasion, and to enforce the laws of the Union. When we take the example of Syria, for example, where National Guard troops have been deployed, and was noted we recently had National Guard troops who were killed in Syria. The mission was not to repel invasion, but to conduct an invasion. The mission was not to suppress an insurrection, but to foment one. And there is no law of the Union that can be pointed to. Not even the 2001 AUMF, which was previously cited and was passed on the grounds of going after Al-Qaeda, which, of course, as we all know, attacked us on 9/11. In fact, in Syria, we literally put al-Qaeda in charge of the government there and have called it a victory. So there's no law that can be pointed to. On a personal note, just on the cost and the toll that our military men and women are facing from this. I'll always remember, I was the bill sponsor in the Maine Senate in my last term for parallel legislation on this, and I'll always remember we heard in the last public hearing there from opponents of the bill, including the Adjutant General for the state, arguing about money. And I thought it was very interesting to not hear arguments about why these wars are justified, why it's, nobody goes around and says anymore, we're defending democracy, we're fighting them over there, so we don't fight them over here, because nobody believes it anymore after 25 years. But we heard a lot about money. And I'll always remember my good friend, Sergeant Aaron Rollins, who served in the Maine Army National Guard and lost one of his buddies in a roadside bomb in Iraq, turning to me afterwards and saying, I can't believe that they're talking about money. I wish they would tell my buddy's mother that his death was worth it, because the state got a few $1 million out of the deal. And I'm sure that Sergeant Aaron Rollins would be here with me today to reinforce that point, except since then he's become one of the 17 military veterans every single day that has taken their own life by suicide. And as we have conversations about money, I just want that question to be in everyone's minds: how much money is worth it when we're talking about the lives of our soldiers in wars that Congress doesn't even care enough to vote on and articulate a clear mission for?
When Eric speaks about our friend Aaron Rollins, you can see the weight of it on Eric's face. Aaron was a veteran. He was a friend. He was a supporter of the movement. He was a man who struggled deeply with reconciling his own service, his own sacrifice, and the political handlings of the war that he served in. These aren't abstract debates. These are real world examples of friends, of brothers in arms. These are visual representations of real consequences.
And I've outlined in my testimony as well, I won't go into the details. I know as a retired senator myself, I have found the literacy rate among senators to be fairly high, so you can read that yourself. But there was a legal memo published several years back by the West Virginia ACLU outlining the legal protections that are in place when we talk about these threats to state funding from the federal government. It's mostly a paper tiger threat, and you're welcome to read that outlined there. So, as well as additional details in my testimony that are before you. So, in conclusion, I appreciate you taking the time to consider this legislation. I certainly hope that you will recommend ought to pass and you will vote for it. But most importantly, I certainly hope that this year, unlike Congress, which refuses to vote on war, I hope that the New Hampshire Senate will do an up or down vote on this bill so all the people can know where their senators stand. Thank you very much.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Man, all right. What a great job by the four supporters of this bill. Up to this point, those supporters, they've argued from constitutional text, from Supreme Court precedent, from statutory structure, and even from moral responsibility. Now, the Adjutant General from the state of New Hampshire, he's going to step forward in opposition. This is where the legal claims become very specific, and this is where we're going to slow things down a little bit.
Thank you.
All right. General, you and Mr. Grady, the last two, you can just decide who goes first. You can go together, whatever you want to do. The two of you are the only two left.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members. For the record, Major General David Michaelitis, Adjutant General, New Hampshire National Guard, Commissioner, Department of Military Affairs and Veteran Services.
Major General David Michaelitis. He's the Adjutant General from the state of New Hampshire. He's the top military officer. He's a cabinet appointee of the governor. He is going to step forward with all the gravitas that his position has frankly earned and deserves. But before we get into the substance of what he says, which is interesting, I want to point out something structural. The Adjutant General, he serves the executive branch. He serves the governor. His duty is to advise and assist the governor and to execute the law. The legislature is supposed to write the laws. There's a difference between coming to answer technical implementation questions and coming to argue against legislation as a matter of policy. When the executive branch actively lobbies the legislature to preserve federal authority or funding streams, we are no longer in neutral advisory posture. This is the executive branch influencing the legislative function.
Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak to you on behalf in opposition of this bill.
There's also this visual element here. The general appears before the legislature, and I don't even like to talk about this because it's somewhat trivial, but it's worth noting. He's wearing his Army combat uniform, the camouflage duty uniform. That uniform is designed for field operations and day-to-day duty. It is not a formal uniform. And when senior officers appear before the legislative bodies in their official capacity, the customary and professional standard is to wear a service or dress uniform. This is not a field briefing. This is testimony before a co-equal branch of government. The legislature, they write the laws. The executive branch, they execute them. When the executive branch appears before the legislature, especially in opposition to a bill, professionalism and respect for the institution should be unmistakable. Once upon a time in the military, when I first joined, you weren't even allowed to stop and fill up your gas tank if you were wearing your camouflage uniform. It was meant for day-to-day duty and field operations only. You couldn't stop at the grocery store, and you shouldn't be seen anywhere in public at an event, picking your children up from school, attending one of their activities in your camouflage uniform. It was forbidden. But here we are. The general is before the legislative body wearing his day-to-day duty uniform. It's not the way it's supposed to be. The executive branch should not interfere with the legislative branch, and demonstrating this type of disrespect for the legislative branch should be noted. And yes, appearing in uniform carries authority and symbolism. That's unavoidable, which makes it even more important that the presentation reflect the seriousness and the neutrality of his position inside the executive branch. But optics aside, let's get to the claims that he's about to make.
So there's a lot been said. Let's try to distill this down, I think, to four things. Number one, just or unjust wars. This is not the venue to discuss just or unjust wars.
All right, that right there. The just versus unjust wars line is a framing device. It's meant to remove the moral dimensions and to force this into a narrow administrative argument. But this bill isn't about just or unjust wars. It's about process, and it's about constitutional authority.
As a bill sponsor, I'm also a combat vet as an Army Ranger and Green Beret who's on 3 deployments from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I know willingly the cost of conflict when I still to this day visit Staff Sergeant Jose Pequeño, the former Sugar Hill Police Chief, every year on the 20th celebration of his, unfortunately, being seriously injured in Iraq.
All right, let me say this clearly. Major General Michaelitis has a distinguished military record, special forces, combat experience, command billets, Army Ranger, Green Beret. That record, it deserves respect. Nothing about this debate diminishes that. But service does not settle constitutional questions. And personal sacrifice, having a friend that was injured and who he brings up in his testimony, does not replace the separation of powers in the Constitution.
All right. 3 things I think you all need to know about. What we talk about is Congress abdicated its war powers responsibility? Number 2 is the federal supremacy law. And number 3 is the federal funding piece of this bill or proposed legislation. Number 1, Congress is not abdicating its war powers responsibility. Congress signed the authorization and use of military force, which allows any president of any political party to do what he thinks is in behalf of our country's national interest. If you have a problem with Congress, take it up with them. The New Hampshire State House is not the venue for this.
All right, let me address that last part first. When he says the New Hampshire State House is not the venue for this issue, that demonstrates a misunderstanding of federalism. The powers granted to the federal government are limited and they're clearly delineated, and all other authority not explicitly granted belongs to the states and to the people. The New Hampshire State House is exactly where this issue belongs because that's where citizens have leverage and because states have a duty to interpose when constitutional boundaries are being violated by the federal government. Now let's respond to what he said about the AUMF. I believe his exact quote was that the AUMF allows any president of any political party to do what he thinks is in behalf of our state and our country's national interest. That is actually not what the 2001 authorization of use of military force says. What it says is that it authorized the president to use force against those responsible for the attacks of September 11th, specifically those who planned the attacks, including Osama bin Laden, those who aided in the attacks, those who harbored those who were responsible, and to dismantle the terror infrastructure that enabled them. That's it. It did not grant the president unlimited authority to use force wherever he believes it is in the national interest. That language simply doesn't exist in the statute. By early 2002, the Taliban government had been removed, al-Qaeda training camps had been destroyed, and the individuals directly responsible for 9/11 were either dead or captured. Fast forward, Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. If the AUMF were being used as originally written, its mission was finite. Instead, over the past 25 years, it's been interpreted, expanded, and stretched to justify operations in multiple countries that weren't even involved in 9/11. And that expansion was not explicitly voted on in a new declaration of war or authorization of use of military force. The general says that Congress has not abdicated its responsibility because it passed an AUMF. But passing a narrowly tailored authorization tied to a specific attack is not the same thing as granting permanent global war authority to any president from any party for any conflict. If the Congress intended the authorization to be open-ended, generational warfare across multiple continents, it could have said so, but it didn't.
Number two, the federal supremacy law. For over 100 years, the governor does not get a vote if Congress says or the president says, I'm activating you in Title 10, involuntary activation for a conflict. The governor or this body does not have the authority to override federal supremacy law. So you look at the 5 pages of the testimony, it goes in clear, concise U.S. code to tell you where Supreme Court precedent has been set to say a state does not get the vote to override a president.
Let's talk about the supremacy clause. It's brought up a lot, and almost every time it's brought up, it's actually misquoted or misreferenced. The Constitution does not say that the federal government or federal law is supreme in all things. It says that federal law made in pursuance of the Constitution is supreme. Federal supremacy does not mean federal omnipotence. If Congress has not fulfilled its constitutional obligation to declare war, invoking supremacy doesn't settle the question. And regarding his comment that the governor does not get a vote, he's collapsing everything that we're going to talk about in Title 10 of U.S. Code, which governs the activation of the National Guard, into one overly broad sentence. See, Title 10 has multiple activation authorities, and some of them give the governor the authority to object or requires the governor to authorize the federalization of the National Guard. Some activation authorities are for training, and some are voluntary. Some are not voluntary, and one even already directly relates to the activation in wartime. We're going to get into that a little bit later too. But just to tease this out a little bit, Title 10 of U.S. Code already requires a declaration of war or national emergency by Congress. It's already in federal law. My point is that federal supremacy does not erase constitutional limits or actual federal laws that are in pursuance of the Constitution. It actually enforces them.
Third point is we talk about money and they don't like to talk about money, but we got to talk about money. So if you look at the second handout is, I will give you 3 specific cases within the last 5 years, how whether it's Congress, the Secretary of War, or the National Guard Bureau has threatened to take a state's funding. So let's go through these 3 cases. In 2021, during the COVID response, the Oklahoma governor wrote a letter to the Secretary of Defense saying, I do not want my Oklahoma National Guard members to be vaccinated with the COVID vaccine. The Secretary of Defense responded, no. It went to court, and Oklahoma lost, and the court ruling injunction said, we will remove your federal funding for your training dollars of your service members if you don't get vaccinated. That was 2021.
All right, whoa, we got to slow that one down. All right, the example the general just gave involves Title 32, not Title 10. I'm talking about the COVID example. That distinction is actually very important. This is where we're going to start getting into the weeds a little bit, and I apologize, but Title 32, it governs the National Guard status when the Guard is operating under state authority under the governor's command, but it's receiving federal funds for domestic missions, for training, or for readiness. Under Title 32 specifically in Section 108, the federal government does have the authority to withhold certain funds if a state fails to meet federally prescribed readiness standards. Readiness standards. In the Oklahoma case specifically, the dispute centered on vaccination requirements and the medical readiness standards under Title 32 funding. But you see, Defend the Guard is not about Title 32 or about vaccines or COVID or anything like it. Defend the Guard doesn't affect domestic missions at all. It does not affect training. It does not affect readiness funding. It addresses one thing and one thing only: Title 10 foreign combat deployments. That's it. Title 10 governs federal activation into overseas combat service, and Title 32 governs federally funded state-controlled readiness and domestic operations. Those are two distinct legal frameworks, completely different and separate from one another. Using a Title 32 funding dispute over medical readiness as proof that Title 10 foreign deployment authority can trigger broad defunding conflates the two separate statutory authorities. The Oklahoma case was about whether Guard members could meet federal medical standards while operating in a federally funded Title 32 status. That is not the same legal question as whether a state may condition the release of Guard into Title 10 foreign combat service absent a congressional declaration of war.
Next issue was in 2025, the National Defense Authorization Act. So we've all heard about the newest branch of the military. It's called the Space Force. As you may or may not know, 7 states and 1 territory have Air National Guard units performing a space mission. The National Guard wanted to have a Space National Guard. So what happened? The former Secretary of the Air Force wrote legislative proposal 480 to Congress to change the law that took units from the Air National Guard out of a state without a governor's consent. So if we think here today, we can say, hey, federal government, we don't want to play. You can't touch our unit or our federal funding. Read the National Defense Authorization Act of 2025, where the Secretary of the Air Force did that. They took over 600 positions from 7 states and a territory without a governor's consent.
All right, what we need to do here is actually separate categories a little bit more, because the example being cited comes from a very specific legislative context. The situation he's referencing involved Legislative Proposal 480 during the debate over the National Defense Authorization Act. That proposal addressed force structure alignment. Specifically, it talked about whether certain Air National Guard space missions would be transferred into active duty space force. At its core, LP 480 contemplated involuntarily moving National Guard airmen, individuals, people, out of their Guard status and into active component in the United States Space Force, effectively transferring personnel, missions, and associated resources away from state control. States objected. They strongly objected to that approach. And in response, Congress and the Department of Defense ultimately backed off the original framework. That is fundamentally different from the claim that the general is implying here. This was not about removing readiness funding from a state National Guard because the state conditioned foreign combat deployments on a congressional declaration of war. It was about where a particular space mission's position would reside within the military's organizational structure. That's important. Force structure realignment and federal funding rescission are two different things. And the general's doing a really good job of conflating and confusing the two, because Legislative Proposal 480, it was a debate over who administratively controls specific space mission roles, the Guard or the active duty Space Force. It was not a proposal to strip a state of its National Guard funding because of a policy disagreement over constitutional war powers. This matters because the example is being used to suggest that there is a precedent that doesn't actually exist. What we're looking at here is an institutional dispute. It was over the organizational structure, not a precedent for wholesale defunding of the state National Guard. It's important to be precise here. This does not prove that funding threats are impossible, but what it does show is that the example cited does not establish a type of funding retaliation being implied. The general's being dishonest. There's also a critical piece of legislation context that often gets left out, and this is the most important part. Legislative Proposal 480 did not pass in its original form, and it's important to note. It encountered significant opposition from every governor across the country and from National Guard leadership. As a result, the version that ultimately adopted in the NDAA had been amended. The general doesn't mention that. You want to know what that amendment was? The amended language preserved the governor's involvement, and it required governor's consent before National Guard personnel, equipment, or funding could be transferred from the state into active duty Space Force. You see, General, I don't think the example you provided says what you think it says. That outcome actually mattered because it demonstrated two things. First, Congress exercised its Article I authority to structure the armed forces, which it absolutely has the power to do. Second, even in that restructuring context, the final law respected the state role in the National Guard, and it did not authorize unilateral federal removal of Guard assets or personnel without state consent. So when this example is presented as evidence that the state could simply lose its Guard structure and funding if it passed Defend the Guard, it doesn't reflect the full legislative outcome at all. What it actually shows is that when structural changes were proposed, states pushed back and the federal government adjusted accordingly. Folks, that's federalism. So this example does not demonstrate that passing Defend the Guard would automatically trigger the loss of federal funds. It demonstrates something else entirely. Disputes over force alignment are resolved through the legislative process. And historically, that process has recognized and preserved the state's role in the National Guard.
Third example would be as recently as September of 2025. The current administration did an executive order to keep DC safe and beautiful. Subsequent to that, the Secretary of War wrote a memo that specified that as you stand up a National Guard Quick Reaction Force and a National Guard Reaction Force, you must adhere to this training and these requirements, and if you don't, your federal funding will be in jeopardy. So there are three specific cases within the last 5 years where the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, National Guard Bureau has threatened to take structure and funding from a state.
All right, once again, here we go. We need to separate legal authorities. The general's kind of confusing the two here. This example concerns a domestic mission, the National Guard being the QRF force in Washington, D.C. Domestic, Title 32. The establishment of a National Guard Quick Reaction Force related to operations in Washington, D.C. The memo that he referenced here is about training standards and readiness requirements tied to federal funding. Those readiness and training standards fall under Title 32 and specifically Section 108, which governs federally funded Guard readiness and compliance requirements. You see, we're starting to see a repeated theme here. Title 32 funding is about maintaining federally required readiness standards, equipment maintenance, medical readiness, training certifications. It's not about overseas combat authorization, and it is not about whether Congress has declared war. In each of the three examples the general provided, the Oklahoma case involved Title 32 medical readiness compliance. The Space Force example involved force structure realignment under the NDAA and ultimately acknowledged and retained a governor's authority over his own militia. And the DC example involved domestic mission training standards tied to readiness funding. None of these examples, General, none of them demonstrate that a state would automatically lose all federal National Guard funding for conditioning Title 10 foreign combat deployments on a congressional declaration of war. They demonstrate that the Department of Defense enforces readiness standards when states accept federal readiness funding. They do not demonstrate that Congress has authorized the executive branch to financially punish a state for insisting on constitutional war declaration procedures before sending its Guard into federal service for overseas combat. So, to be crystal clear, Congress absolutely has authority over the structure and funding of the armed forces. But conflating readiness compliance under Title 32 with the constitutional question of Title 10 foreign combat deployments is a categorical error. What we've heard are three examples of federal leverage related to readiness and structure. What we have not heard is a statutory example showing that the state passing Defend the Guard would automatically forfeit all Guard funding. Those are wildly different claims.
So what is the National Guard? The National Guard's primary purpose to act as the combat reserve of the United States Army and Air Force. That is why we have HIMARS, high mobility artillery rocket systems. That is why we have the KC-46 refueler. The KC-46 refueler, those 12 airplanes cost over $3 billion and provide us almost 1,100 airmen at the Pease Air National Guard base. And if you don't think the 15 other Air National Guard wings in the country with the Eisenhower era KC 135 wants to refuelers, just ask.
All right, so the general says the National Guard's primary purpose is to act as a combat reserve for the United States Army and the Air Force. That's certainly how the Guard's been used over the past 25 years, but it's not the whole constitutional story. I love when people pick and choose the parts that best support their argument. See, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution, the supreme law, gives Congress the power to call forth the militia, the National Guard, to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. That's the original constitutional design. The militia, which evolved in today's National Guard, was intended first and foremost as a state-based domestic defensive force. Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Section 12301, Paragraph A, provides that the reserve components, including the National Guard, may be called into federal service when Congress has declared war or national emergency. The first paragraph of that section. That presumes something critical, that the constitutional trigger, which is a congressional authorization or declaration, has already occurred. The Guard absolutely serves as a reserve component to the active force. Absolutely. But its federalization for overseas combat is constitutionally conditioned. It was never designed to be an automatically available pool of manpower for indefinite foreign conflicts absent a declaration of war. You see, there's a difference between being a combat reserve when constitutionally called upon and being treated as a standing expeditionary force by default.
So in summary, I admire the admiration of the bill sponsor. The fight is with Congress, not in the New Hampshire State House. Federal supremacy law says you cannot trump what Congress or the president tells you to do. And number three is it will allow us to lose our federal funding, which has the equipment that provides our soldiers. So when another individual testifies, says, hey, I don't like your fiscal note of $395 million, think of the Super Bowl. You don't train in readiness for a domestic operation mission. You train in readiness for your wartime mission. All of our pay and allowance, all of our equipment, all of the maintenance are 100% federally reimbursed. Subject to your questions, that's all I have.
Hey, here we go. The general's right. He's right that we train to a military standard. I think he called it the Super Bowl. A truly peaceful nation prepares for war and prays it never has to fight one. But readiness assumes something. It assumes that if we are sent into war, that war has been constitutionally authorized. Preparation is wisdom. Entering war without constitutional process is erosion. And when we send citizen soldiers into foreign combat, it should carry the informed consent of the American people through their representatives. Now, there was a throwaway line in that last little bit from the general. He said, and I believe his quote was, federal law says you cannot trump what Congress or the president tells you to do. Now, this one really doesn't sit well with me at all. Folks, this is in the state of New Hampshire, the Granite State, the live free or die state. We're supposed to do what the elected bums in the federal government tell us to do. The president does not tell us what to do like we're subordinates in the chain of command. In our system, we tell them what they're authorized to do, and they execute within those limits. Federalism is not a chain of command. It's divided sovereignty. And in the military structure, you follow orders. In a constitutional republic, the federal government follows the Constitution. All right, let's move on. You noticed from earlier that none of these overly attentive senators could be bothered to ask any clarifying questions of the bill's sponsor or those who spoke in support of the bill. But look at how engaged they all are now, all of a sudden, that the general is before them in his combat uniform adorned with patches and stars and whatnot. All of a sudden, they ask several scripted questions designed to strengthen the general's National Guard Bureau talking points.
Senator Brooks, I saw you first, and then Senator Waters, and I think I saw some of the other hands go up over here. So,
thank you, General, and thank you for taking my question. So, I heard that Congress would not defund, but isn't it true that Congress actually funds the National Guard Bureau, and it's the Bureau that dictates who gets the money or can pull the money back.
Yes, ma'am, you are correct.
Okay. So isn't it possible that if we pass something like this, the National Congress their hands are wiped clean. They gave the money. It's the National Guard Bureau that's going to pull the money back.
Yes, ma'am, you're correct, because we're essentially saying we don't want to do our federal mission is what we're funded for.
Right, final question.
Yes, ma'am.
How many states have passed this?
0.
Senator Birdsell raises a very serious question. Congress appropriates the money, but doesn't the National Guard Bureau decide who gets funded and who doesn't? That sounds simple, but the process is not simple. Let's walk through how National Guard funding actually works. First, under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress controls the purse. I think we all know that. Every year, the process begins with the president's budget submission. That goes to the Department of Defense, and from there, it moves through the Office of Management and Budget. Then the House and Senate Armed Services Committees draft the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. We hear about it every year, which authorizes force structure, end strength, programs, and missions. After authorization, the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees draft the Defense Appropriations Act, which actually funds those authorized programs. And within that structure, you have the Department of Defense, you have the Department of the Army and the Department of the Air Force, you have the National Guard Bureau, you have the Council of Governors, you have the House and Senate Armed Services Committee members, you have the House and Senate Appropriations Committee members, and ultimately, you have the full Congress. And beyond that, force structure decisions go through what's called the Program Objective Memorandum, or the POM. You'll hear people talk about that once in a while. The POM is a multi-year planning mechanism used by the service departments to align missions, personnel levels, modernization priorities, and funding across a 5-year window. It's not reactive. It's not emotional. It's built years in advance. The Army and the Air Force develop their POMs. The National Guard Bureau feeds into those plans. They're reviewed inside the Department of Defense. They're rolled into the president's budget submission, and then they're sent to Congress for authorization and appropriation. Changing force structure is not something that happens overnight because some National Guard Bureau general is irritated that a state passed some sort of defend the guard legislation. You see, it requires programming adjustments, budget realignment, congressional notification, and often even statutory changes. The National Guard Bureau does not receive a blank check and then decide which states get money and which ones get punished. Funding is appropriated in a legally binding accounts, personnel, operations, maintenance, procurement, military construction. Those appropriations are governed by statute. If funds are to be rescinded, reprogrammed, or force structure changed, that requires statutory authority and congressional involvement. We even have the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which Mr. Friedman talked about earlier in the hearing. The Impoundment Control Act prevents the executive branch or any member of it from unilaterally withholding funds that Congress has already appropriated. So the idea that Congress can wipe its hands clean, the Guard Bureau can simply pull money back if New Hampshire passes a bill like Defend the Guard, that's a massive oversimplification of the process. Now, could Congress change force structure? Sure, they do it all the time. Takes a long time to do it. Could Congress amend funding statutes? Yep, they could. But that would require open legislative action and political accountability. And I want you to find me one congressman, one senator that would allow military funding and readiness to be stripped from his state as a retaliation for the state passing a prohibition on an unauthorized deployment of the National Guard. You see, it's not a quiet administrative lever that can be pulled behind closed doors. If Congress wants to change Guard funding in response to a state asserting its constitutional position, Congress has to own that decision. It can't hide behind the Bureau.
Thank you.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, General, for all you do and for being here today. Just two questions. One is, you mentioned the KC-46s, and could you just talk a little bit further about how essential that operation is, and if the duty calls for national defense, you got to be ready to go?
Yes, sir, it's critical. So I would give you an analogy would be is whether you like it or you're not, the recent conflict or the thing that went on in Venezuela, the Vermont National Guard was involved with that. So you don't know when your nation calls. So whether it's combat aircraft or what we call Air Mobility Command, which is transports or refuelers, it's primarily a Title X mission to support whatever contingency or emergency operation that could be ongoing throughout the globe.
All right, before I get into the policy question that is raised here, I want to pause on something that the general said, because I think tone matters when we're talking about sending Americans into harm's way. Referring to a real-world military operation as the Venezuela thing makes it sound casual, almost routine. But these aren't abstract events. These are deployments that involve American service members, real risks, and potentially combat operations. That deserves a little more gravity, because for the men and the women involved, it's not a thing. It's war, or the possibility of war. Now, on the substance of the example that was just given, the general pointed to the Vermont National Guard's involvement related to the Venezuela thing as evidence of why readiness is essential. And I agree with him on readiness. Units need to be trained, equipped, and ready to respond when called. We agree. We're aligned. But the timeline of his example, it's important because it actually illustrates where this bill fits into a real-world scenario. He mentions that the Vermont National Guard was involved in the Venezuela thing. But what he doesn't tell you is that the Vermont unit had already been placed on federal active duty orders. They were already on Title X status for a real-world non-combat mission, air refueling. That means that they were no longer operating under state authority. They were already part of the federal force, and just like any active duty unit, they were subject to federal mission tasking. So when the Venezuela thing became a thing, the airmen from Vermont were retasked to support the Venezuela thing, and the Defend the Guard legislation would not have interfered with that retasking at all, because the airmen from Vermont were no longer members of the Vermont Air National Guard. They were, for all legal purposes, active duty airmen of the United States Air Force. Because once a Guard unit is on Title X, the governor or the states, they don't control them anymore. And the state can't simply pull them back. That's the current legal structure, and everybody agrees on that. That's exactly where Defend the Guard applies. Before the unit is federalized, this bill doesn't try to interfere once troops are already federalized. It doesn't attempt to disrupt missions midstream. It doesn't apply to forces already on Title X. It applies only to that one moment, that brief moment in time. It applies at the decision point where National Guard units are about to be transferred from the states into federal active duty for the purpose of participating in foreign war or combat operations. All this bill says, very straightforward, is that if the mission is war, then the constitutional preconditions should be satisfied first. And that means that Congress has to authorize it in the way the Constitution requires. So the Vermont example doesn't really undermine this bill at all. It actually highlights the gap that we're trying to fix. Because once troops are federalized, the decision's already been made. Defend the Guard is the stopgap that ensures the constitutional step happens before that transfer, not after. You can believe in readiness, and we do. You can believe in rapid response, and we essentially do. And you can still insist that when Americans are sent into foreign combat, that the decision to war belongs to Congress, which we do. That's the principle that this bill is trying to restore. So to give another example using the Venezuela thing, had the Vermont National Guardsmen been working their day jobs, teachers, tradesmen, police officers, and they got the call that night that they were going to go and be involved in the Venezuela thing and they were going to be transferred onto Title X, Defend the Guard could have stopped at that moment and said, is there a declaration? But in the example that he used with Vermont already, they were already in federal service when Venezuela became a thing. So the general, once again, is muddying the water, confusing the language, and using an example that doesn't actually support his position.
Thank you. Just one more.
Follow up?
You know, there's been a lot of discussion of money, and I understand that, but wouldn't it be fair to say that those people serving the Guard who have answered the call of duty and served, and some have fallen and paid the ultimate sacrifice, that they weren't doing it because they were worried about New Hampshire losing funding? They were doing it because of their patriotism and following the Constitution, the call of their commander-in-chief. Wouldn't that be the case?
Yes, sir. I would say the number one reason people join is a sense of service or purpose. So there's something bigger and better than beyond themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additional questions? Senator Lang?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, General, for taking my question. So going back to the U.S. Constitution, Commander-in-Chief, defined in the statute, chief leader of the active military, federal military forces, correct?
Yes, sir.
Follow, serious question. So when I think about this, when the president, as part of his Commander-in-Chief role, federalizes the National Guard, there's no role for the governor anywhere in the Constitution, is there?
Correct.
Boy, I don't agree with the premise of that question. The Constitution does not spell out a detailed procedural role for governors during federalization. That's true. But it also does not treat the militia, today's National Guard, as purely a federal piece of property. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 and 16, the militia clauses give Congress the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. It also gives Congress the ability to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. But the same clause explicitly reserves to the states the appointment of their own officers, the authority of training the militia according to federal discipline. That reservation is not decorative, it's constitutional. And Article 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and of the militia when it's called into actual service of the United States. That language is conditional. The president commands the National Guard when it has been lawfully called into federal service. Lawfully called into federal service. The Constitution creates a dual status force. Before federalization, the Guard belongs to the states. After lawful federalization, command shifts to the president. To say that the governor has no role anywhere in the Constitution ignores the explicit reservation of authority to the states in the militia clause. Defend the Guard addresses the moment before federalization, when the Guard is still under state authority. It asks a simple constitutional question. Has Congress fulfilled its Article 1 duty to declare war before a state force is transferred into federal combat service? That's not eliminating federal authority. That is insisting that federal authority be exercised according to the constitutional conditions. The Constitution does not erase the states when federal power is invoked. It divides power on purpose.
Lastly, last question.
Sir?
It's my understanding that when we're talking about a declaration of war, that there's been court cases made, and it basically came down to if Congress funds an activity of the military, that is the equivalency of a declaration of war. So if they fund an activity in a foreign country and they provide the financial resources for the military to engage in that, that is the equivalency of an act of war.
So I haven't heard of it put in that perspective, but I would agree with you. I think generally speaking for us is it's really just the activation piece of it. If the president says you're involuntary activated or mobilized, there's no recourse. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. We do it.
Thank you.
All right. This is a very, very serious claim. The idea being suggested here is that if Congress funds the military operation, that funding is equivalent to a declaration of war. I don't even know if I need to say this, but that's not what the Constitution says. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to declare war. That power is distinct from the power to raise and support armies and distinct from the power to appropriate funds. Framers separated those powers intentionally. Declaring war is a deliberate political act. Appropriating money is not the same thing. What has happened over the last several decades is a reversal of the constitutional order. Instead of Congress debating and declaring war first and funding it second, presidents initiate military operations. Congress then continues to appropriate money after the fact. That, folks, is not the same as a declaration of war. That is an acquiescence to it. Funding an ongoing operation does not retroactively create a constitutional authorization for its initiation. If that were the case, the declaration of war clause would be meaningless. There have been court cases where judges have declined to intervene in war powers disputes, often calling them political questions. I'm not going to dispute that. But judicial reluctance to adjudicate those does not transform appropriations into a declaration of war. That is not what it does. The constitutional text still distinguishes between them. The framers required Congress to declare war so that the people's representatives would be politically accountable before blood and treasure are committed. If writing checks after troops are already deployed is treated as the equivalent of declaring war, then the constitutional safeguard collapses. Authorization must precede action. It cannot be manufactured after the fact through appropriations. All right, I'm going to take a quick break. I got to run down to the Capitol building here in Idaho and work on Defend the Guard, which has a hearing this morning. So I'll finish the rest of this reactionary video when I get back, and hopefully I have an update on Idaho for you when that happens. All right, I'm back. A little wardrobe change. I just got back from the Idaho Capitol building where Senator Ben Adams introduced the Defend the Guard bill for the 2026 session in the Idaho Senate, and it passed the original introductory hearing. So we're off and running in Idaho, but I wanted to come back and get the rest of this commentary done on this video. So again, pardon the wardrobe change, and let's get back into this. I think we just left off with authorizations that funding does not equal authorization, and then it can't be manufactured after the fact through any sort of appropriation. So let's get back into the hearing and let's get going from here.
Okay, my turn. I was at a briefing down in Washington, D.C. with the Lieutenant General, I believe is your boss. And I want to confirm that he has expressed the same things he expressed to me, is that in his discretion, when he is doling out the money that has been appropriated, that he does so in a manner where the mission of the Guard will be advanced, okay? And if some state decided to not participate in these things, it would influence his decision on the appropriation of those monies.
Sir, 100% agree. The National Guard is a combat reserve of the United States Army and Air Force. It's because, as our forefathers mentioned, they don't want a large standing army. So a lot of resources have been put into the reserve component, both the National Guard and reserves.
Whoa. The language that we just heard demonstrates some serious misunderstandings. The chairman described an anonymous lieutenant general in Washington who is the adjutant general's boss, who talks about doling out the dollars that have been appropriated based on whether a state is advancing the mission of the Guard or not. That framing is not how defense funding works. Congress does not appropriate money to be casually doled out at somebody's discretion. Those funds are appropriated in specific statutory accounts: personnel, operations and maintenance, procurement, military construction. Each one is defined to a specific legal purpose. You see, there's no discretionary category called advance the mission of the Guard. The mission is already defined. The Guard is supposed to defend the United States. It's supposed to maintain readiness. It's supposed to protect the homeland, and it's supposed to support lawful missions. So when we hear suggestions that the funding decision might hinge on whether a state participates in some sort of misguided adventure or not, we need to ground that discussion in law, not in implication. If funds are going to be withheld or redistributed, that requires statutory authority. We've already talked about that. It can't be based on an informal judgment about alignment. Defense funding is not patronage. Let me say that again. Defense funding is not patronage. It is a statutory obligation. Now, let's also be clear about authority and the adjutant general's boss, as the chairman put it. The adjutant general of the state of New Hampshire has one boss in his capacity as the adjutant general of New Hampshire, and that's the governor of New Hampshire, and by extension, the people of New Hampshire. There is no general at the National Guard Bureau who is the adjutant general superior when he's operating as the head of the state military department. None. And in his role as the adjutant general under state authority, the chain of civilian control runs through the governor. It's not a courtesy. It's the structure of our federal system, and it's how it was built.
Additional questions? Seeing none, General, thank you very much. Mr. Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. Good staff officer always tells you let the general speak first, and you come in afterwards and kind of talk to a few things he didn't talk to.
All right, next up is Mr. Grady. I'm going to let Mr. Grady's testimony play mostly uninterrupted. He makes a number of points, and I want you to hear them directly from his own mouth. But I do want to step back and remind everybody of something very structural. Mr. Grady is speaking from the executive branch perspective. Not necessarily improper. Executive officials and members of the cabinet, they often testify before the legislature. That's part of the process, but there is an important boundary. The executive branch's constitutional role is to execute the law. The legislature's constitutional role is to make the law. The legislature is not subordinate to the executive policy preferences at all. The legislature is a co-equal branch of government. And when executive officials come before lawmakers and argue that a bill should not pass because it complicates federal missions, that's advice, not endorsement, and not opposition. And it's definitely not authority. The decision about whether New Hampshire conditions the release of its National Guard into foreign combat zones is a legislative decision. It belongs to the elected representatives of the people in the state.
My name is Kevin Grady. I'm a 28-year resident of Hooksett, New Hampshire, and I'm also a 25-year Air Force veteran. Today, I'm representing the State Veterans Advisory Committee. I've testified to all of you folks before, and I think you all know what we do. We unanimously oppose this, as we have the last 6 legislative sessions and different iterations of this same kind of bill. And it all boils down to the same argument that the general already made. The venue for this fight is the U.S. Congress. It's not here at the state level. If you want to look it up, Title 10, U.S. Code 12301, paragraph F is the one that says when the National Command Authority activates troops, the governor can't object. And I would take that to mean that the state can't object on behalf of the governor as well.
All right, I'm going to be very, very careful here because there's an opportunity now to get way down in the weeds and get really complicated and start talking about statute and code. And it can get quite boring, but I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds because it's important to understand that they are using a section of code as proof that doesn't actually do what they say it does. When Mr. Grady cites Title 10, Section 12301F as proof that governors, and by extension the states, have no role or ability to object to a National Guard being called up, it's worth slowing down and looking carefully at what the statute actually says. The structure matters because subsection F is being stretched way beyond what it actually covers. You see, Title 10 U.S. Code Section 12301 is not a single blanket authority. It's not just paragraph or subsection F. It's a set of distinct activation authorities that's organized by circumstance. At the top of the list in 1231 is paragraph A. And this is the most serious scenario. This is war or national emergency declared by Congress. It allows the reserve components, including the National Guard, to be ordered to active duty only after Congress has made the political decision that the nation is in a war posture. The premise is constitutional accountability first, activation second. Then after the war activation in 12301A, you have lower order activation authorities. And I'm going to go down the list and kind of list them one by one. And this is where I can get a little bit in the weeds. Section 12301, paragraph B is for limited training up to 15 days per year. That means that the Guard or the Reserve can be called up to Title 10 status for annual training. Okay, 12301C, it requires that units, when they're activated together, that they remain fundamentally intact and they're not divided up by individual members once they're activated. 12301D, this is a voluntary activation. It requires the consent of the service member so that they can voluntarily go into active duty. And then 12301E is about the length of time from notice until actual activation. Only after those does subsection F appear, which is the one that Mr. Grady references. And it's very specific in its text. It says the following: the consent of a governor described in subsections B and D may not be withheld because of any objection to the location, purpose, type, or schedule of such active duty. So by its own terms, by its own text, subsection F, the inability of a governor to object, is tied to subsections B and D. It says it right in the statute. It's a narrow rule that prevents governors from blocking overseas training or voluntary duty based on any objections to where or how that training occurs. It does not say that governors can never object in any federalization scenario, and it does not speak to the war authority that's found in subsection A. This reading, it's reinforced by the Supreme Court case most often cited along subsection F, which is called the Montgomery Amendment. And that is a Supreme Court case called Perpich v. Department of Defense. See, Governor Perpich sued the federal government because of a disagreement in the way that the National Guard was being called up to serve in training capacities in Central America. And the Perpich decision upheld Congress's authority to send Guard units overseas for training without a governor's consent. The case was about training missions, and the court resolved the dispute about training. It was not about combat deployments at all, and it didn't address the use of the Guard in foreign hostilities. So when subsection F and the Perpich decision are cited as if they prove that governors have no constitutional relevance in every federalization context, that goes way beyond both the statutory text and the case law. The statute draws distinctions, and those distinctions actually matter. And so we want to be precise here. This argument, it does not depend on claiming that 12301A, which is the War Powers Authorization, gives governors a veto over declared war call-ups, because it doesn't. The point is narrower and much stronger. Subsection F is specific to training. It operates only in connection with the training and the voluntary activation authorities, and it can't be read as a blanket rule eliminating any state role in policy decisions related to foreign combat deployments. See, that's why 12301F does not answer the defend the Guard question, and it shouldn't be used to debate against it. Defend the Guard does not restrict training, readiness, overseas exercises, or routine operational preparation. It operates in a much different lane entirely. Only foreign combat deployments. That is a war powers question, and subsection F is not a war powers provision. If the argument is that Congress is the proper venue, that's fair, and it's probably a correct institutional point. But citing 12301F does not demonstrate that states are powerless. All it establishes is that a governor cannot block overseas training or voluntary duty on objections to its location, its purpose, under subsections B and D only. All right, that's in the weeds. That's a lot. But the core takeaway is this, and it's simple. Training authority does not swallow up war authority. A provision designed to prevent governors from vetoing overseas training cannot be used to bypass the subsection that begins with war and requires a congressional action. War carries a different constitutional weight, and the statute reflects that hierarchy. See, defend the Guard does not create a new standard. It insists on the highest standard already embedded in our constitutional structure, and it's reflected in section 12301, paragraph A itself. Before citizens are sent into foreign hostilities, Congress must authorize the war, and the public deserves that accountability.
Trust me when I tell you that all of our members, many of whom are combat veterans, we fully understand the sponsors of this bill, their sincerity. We do not question their patriotism at all. Our whole issue with this is we don't feel like it's the proper venue. The National Guard is one of the great deals for American taxpayers. On the one hand, you've got this Title 32 mission, which is doing things for the state, which allows us to have a ready reserve of people if we need to go pick somebody up off of the side of a mountain when they shouldn't be there in the wintertime, okay? Or we need to send to our neighbors in Vermont when they have a flood, we can send helicopters over there to pick people off the tops of their roofs. And if you're the federal government and that unit has a search and rescue mission, okay, it doesn't get any better for realistic training than actually doing a real live search and rescue mission. So they'll fund that. And as the general said, most of the money that we get spent on our Guard comes from the federal government. It comes through the state and then it gets rerouted there. The National Command Authority, they have the ability to just activate forces, and we have a very good relationship on planned deployments, things that we know where people are going to go out of town that are worked years in advance. Everybody coordinates all of those things. At the end of the day, my last job in the Air Force was sitting behind a big steel desk. And if you want to have a fighter pilot sit behind the desk, the only thing that matters is where's the desk. And this happened to be at Ramstein Air Base in Germany on the Air Forces in Europe desk. And I can tell you that at a headquarters level, they're pretty intolerant of people that decide they don't want to follow the rules. They really are.
Oh, I get it. Headquarters is intolerant of people who don't want to follow the rules. Oh, okay. I got it. Let's talk about the rules, Mr. Grady. Where is that same righteous indignation when Congress refuses to follow the rules? Where is the righteous indignation when the executive branch sends troops into foreign combat without a declaration of war. What about that rule? Where's the righteous indignation when Article 1 of the Constitution is treated like a suggestion instead of a command? Righteous indignation should only run downhill. It shouldn't only be reserved for states that insist on constitutional process. Defend the Guard is not refusing to follow the rules. It's demanding that the highest rule be followed first.
And as I look at this from wearing my staff officer hat, and Senator Birdsell's point is quite is correct here. You know, the way the money flows to the service secretary from the Secretary of Defense, and then it goes down to the individual services, and they portion off a section for the Guard, and the National Guard Bureau runs that money. And we keep talking about the loss of the revenue. That it's not that they're going to take money out of the budget; they're just going to move it somewhere else. They're just going to take those forces and move them somewhere else. You know, there are fighter pilots all over the Air Force flying the F-16 that would love to be flying the F-35 that those guys over in Vermont are flying, the Guard. There are, and as the General mentioned, there are captains all over our Air Force right now that are flying a 70-year-old airframe that would love to be flying our KC-46s. But here we are, and we have that. And there's an active duty squadron right alongside our Guard folks, training every day, interoperability every day, doing a real world mission that's very important. But I need you to consider that that real world mission could easily take place from Portland or Cape Cod, very easily. Now, it takes money to move forces. It does. So nothing would happen right away were we to pass this and were we to find a governor that wanted to sign this. Okay, and I'll leave you to make your own decisions on whether a governor of any stripe would actually sign this bill. Okay, but, you know, you probably wouldn't see anything right away, but 2-3 years from now, if you start to see a KC-46 size hangar go up at Cape Cod or Portland, yeah, you're about to lose your taker force.
All right, now let's move from principle to process. This description is an absolute oversimplification. The National Guard Bureau does not get a blank pot of money and then decide who gets rewarded and who gets punished. Appropriations are statutory. It's authorized through the NDAA, appropriated through the Defense Appropriations, and the stakeholders include the Department of Defense, the service bureaus, the NGB, the Council of Governors, Armed Service Committees, Appropriations Committees, and Congress. We've talked about it earlier in this episode. The idea that the NGB can arbitrarily say, we're taking $1 from New Hampshire and giving it to Vermont because a legislature insisted on constitutional war powers is an absolute paper tiger. Defense funding is governed by statute, not by attitude.
The other thing that could happen if we were to pass this legislation is they're just going to ignore us. And they're going to say, hey, if I need your forces, I'm just going to go get them. And you're going to go, wait, no, I got this piece of paper that says you can't do that. They go, forces? What forces? You don't have any forces. Those are my forces. Says so right here in Title 10 of U.S. law. You know, those forces belong to me now. Don't care what you did at the state level.
All right, listen carefully to what's being suggested right here. If the federal government is going to ignore state law and simply take the Guard away, then we are no longer debating policy. We're debating constitutional boundaries. Defend the Guard is not about confrontation. It's about creating a legal fulcrum. Without state law, there is no standing, and without standing, there is no judicial review. And if the federal government federalizes Guard forces for foreign combat without proper constitutional authorization, the answer is not defiance. It's litigation. A lever without a fulcrum does nothing, and Defend the Guard is that fulcrum.
So the place to have this fight is at the federal level. I'm not optimistic. I wish I could tell you that I was optimistic that they're going to do anything like this at the state level. Because if you look back through the life cycle of this legislation, year after legislative session that I've come up here and like Don Quixote jousting at a windmill, we've had a Democratic president with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. We now have a Republican president with a Republican House and a Republican Senate in Washington, D.C. And has anybody taken up this legislation? They have not. And I think that the reason that they have not is what's convenient for them right now is an authorization for use of military force. We haven't declared war since 1942. The last people that we declared war against were Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. And at that time in World War II, we went on a wartime footing in the United States. We went on this wartime economy. We asked people to make stuff that they didn't want to make to support the war effort. We don't need to do that anymore. I personally think Congress has declared war for the last time. I really do. I think the AUMF is the way they're going to operate going forward. Could they tighten that up? Sure. Would I like them to tighten that up? Absolutely. I'd love for them to tighten that up. But right now, this is not the way to get this done. The way to get this done is to get the political will in D.C. and not here in Concord. So subject to your questions, that's all I really want to tell you.
Questions from the senators? Senator Lang.
So assuming this passed, what would happen to General Michaelitis when the president says, I want you to activate your troops, and the governor says, sit in your chair, do nothing?
You're saying now if the president decides
All right,
to
now I
activate
want you
our
to
forces,
watch what
General
happens.
Michaelitis says, oh, we got the state law.
Senator
What's gonna
Carson,
happen?
who is the president of the Senate, she just
I don't know.
walks
More
in
than
and
likely
takes her
what's gonna
seat
happen
in the
is that the forces are
final
gonna
minute
pass
of the
through
hearing.
to wherever they're
And for the
being activated
first
to under
time,
the command of
the
somebody
entire
else.
committee is present at one time.
Questions from the senators?
The chairman mentions that the 4 people testified in support, 2 people testified against the bill, 47 people signed up online in support, and 0 signed up online opposed. By my count, that's 51 in support and 2 opposed. Now, they go into executive session. This is where they make the decision about passing or killing the bill. Executive session lasted 96 seconds. No discussion. In fact, there was even joking about
Chair
killing
would
the
move
bill.
ITL.
Second.
I'm. Yep. What's our aide's name? Cool. I believe that Senator Carson's folder book is in the office.
She's got it. We're good.
This
We
is
just
what
heard
we
it.
were just hearing. I wanted to do this one quick. All right, I moved ITL. And Senator Lang seconds.
No, I did.
All right, everybody seconded. Okay, discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor of ITL say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. And there's 7 of us now. 8 now? Okay. Okay, 8-0. Consent, all those in favor of consent say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. And I'll take that one out. All right.
Executive session is where they dismiss the room and where they're supposed to review the written submissions, discuss the merits of the bill, which the chairman actually acknowledged earlier in the hearing. And I told you we'd revisit that point. Well, here it is. They were in executive session for 96 seconds. Remember, 51 people offered comments or online registration in support of the bill, 2 against. They were in executive session for 96 seconds. There was no discussion. There was no debate. There was not a single submission read aloud. There was no weighing of the merits. And there was joking about how excited they were all to make the second to the motion to kill the bill. Clearly, the table was set before the hearing ever began. Folks, this is modern governance. It's not the way the system is supposed to work, but here's what's important to note. For the first time, we have a roll call vote in the New Hampshire Senate Committee. We now have 8 identified and named politicians who oppose Defend the Guard, and that is where citizen activation begins. We start with a roll call vote, and now we know who stands where. We know who stands in the way, and this is where we get to go to work. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we're picking up what you're throwing down. We hear you loud and clear. Live free or die doesn't mean live obedient and die quietly. We'll see you in the next round because this fight isn't over yet. So there you have it. 96 seconds of executive session, no discussion, no debate, 51 people in support, 2 opposed, and a roll call vote to kill the bill. The Adjutant General also submitted a 5-page written report, which I was barely able to get into my hands just a few minutes ago. And I'm going to summarize that in a future newsletter and possibly in a follow-up video because there are several additional claims in that document that deserve a response. But for now, we have work to do in New Hampshire. The primaries are coming up. I'll be in New Hampshire on March 7th at the Liberty Forum with the Free State Project and I hope you'll come and join us. I'll be one of the keynote speakers alongside my friend, the brilliant one, Scott Horton. At Liberty Forum, we'll be talking about very specific actions that activists can take, not just to bring Defend the Guard back through the House, but to push it through the Senate committee, onto the Senate floor, and ultimately across the governor's desk. This movement doesn't end because one committee voted it down. It begins with clarity, and now we have clarity. If you want to be part of it, visit bringourtroopshome.us. Follow us on all social platforms at TroopsHomeUS, and then visit defendtheguard.us. Chip in a few bucks. Join our reoccurring monthly donors club. Thank you for standing with us, and we will see you next time on the Bring Our Troops Home podcast.